person to talk about is Ernest Becker himself.
Sure.
So how did he face his death? Is there something interesting, personal?
I think so.
there?
So interesting to me is Becker, also from a Jewish family, claimed to be atheistic, did not identify ultimately as Jewish. I believe he converted to Christianity, but was himself a religious person. And he said he became religious when his first child was born.
Now, religious, what does that mean?
Well,
Does he have a faith in? Well, let's talk more.
Yeah.
Most importantly, is the afterlife.
He
What's
was
his view on the afterlife?
agnostic on that, but he did. Now, the denial of death is there's a chapter devoted to Kierkegaard, and he talks about, for Kierkegaard, if you want to become a mature individual, if you want to learn something, you go to the university. If you want to become a more mature individual, according to Kierkegaard, you got to go to the school of anxiety. And what Kierkegaard said is that we have to let this vague dis-ease, put a hyphen between dis and ease, about death. Kierkegaard's point is you have to really think about that. You have to think about it and feel it. You got to let it seep into your mind, at which point, according to Kierkegaard, basically you realize that your present identity is fundamentally a cultural construction. You didn't choose the time and place of your birth. You didn't choose your name. You didn't choose necessarily even the social role that you occupy. You might have chosen from what's available in your culture, but not from the full palette of human opportunities. And so what Kierkegaard said is that we need to realize that we've been living a lie of sorts. Becker calls it a necessary lie. And we have to momentarily dispose of that. And so now Kierkegaard says, well, here I am. I have shrugged off all of the cultural accoutrements that I have used to define myself. And now what am I, or who am I? This is like the ancient Greek tragedy where the worst thing was to be no one or no thing. All right, at this point, Kierkegaard said, you're really dangling on the precipice of oblivion. And some people tumble into that abyss and never come out. On the other hand, Kierkegaard said that what you can now do metaphorically and literally is to rebuild yourself from the ground up. And in the New Testament, there's something you have to die in order to be reborn. And Kierkegaard's view, though, is that there's only one way to do that. This is his proverbial leap into faith. And in Kierkegaard's case, it was faith in Christianity, that you can't have unbridled faith in cultural constructions. The only thing that you can have unequivocal faith in is some kind of transcendent power. All right, but of course, this raises the question of, well, is that just another death-denying belief system?
Right.
And at the end of the denial of death, Becker admits that there's no way to tell, while still advocating for what is ultimately a religious stance. Now, one of the things that I don't understand, and Becker has been the most singularly potent influence in my academic and personal life, but a year or two ago, I started reading Martin Heidegger. I'm reading Being and Time, and what I now wonder is why Becker, who refers to Heidegger from time to time in his work, why he didn't take Heidegger more seriously, because Heidegger is like a secular Kierkegaard. he has the same thing, which is death anxiety. Oh, and I should have pointed out that what Kierkegaard says is that death anxiety, most people don't go to the school of anxiety. They flee from death anxiety by embracing their cultural beliefs. Kierkegaard says they then tranquilize themselves with the trivial. And I love that phrase.
That's beautiful.
It's a beautiful phrase because at the end of The Denial of Death, Becker's like, look, the average American is either drinking or shopping or watching television, and they're all the same thing. Right? Heidegger says the same thing. He says, look, and he acknowledges Kierkegaard. He says, what makes us feel unsettled, and evidently that's an English translation of angst, that it's we don't feel at home in the world. Heidegger says that's death anxiety. And one direction is the Kierkegaard one. Heidegger calls it a flight from death. You just unself-reflexively cling to your cultural constructions. And Heidegger borrows the term tranquilized, but he points out that he doesn't care for that term because tranquilized sounds like you're subdued, when in fact what most culturally constructed meat puppets do is to be frenetically engaged with their surroundings to ensure that they never sit still long enough to actually think about anything consequential. Heidegger says there's another way, though. He's like, what you can do is to come to terms with that death anxiety in the following way. Thing number one is to realize that not only are you going to die, but your death can happen at any given moment. So for Heidegger, if you say, I know I'm going to die in some vaguely unspecified future moment, that's still death denial because you're saying, yeah, not me, not now.
Yeah.
Heidegger's point is you need to get to the point where you need to realize that, I need to realize that I can walk outside and get smote by a comet, or I can stop for gas on the way home and catch the virus and be dead in 2 days, or any number of potentially unanticipated and uncontrollable fatal outcomes. But
That's brilliant, by the way. Sorry. To bring it into the now.
Yeah, it is brilliant. I agree, Lex, and this is why I'm wondering why didn't Becker notice this? Because that's the being and time thing. Yeah. Is it's got to be now, right? And then he says, so now I've dealt somewhat with the death part, and now he says, now you've got to deal with what he calls existential guilt. And he says, well, all right, what you have to realize that, like it or not, you have to make choices. This is Jean-Paul Sartre. We are condemned by virtue of consciousness to choosing. But Heidegger's a little bit more precise. He's like, look, as I was saying earlier, in reality, you're an insignificant speck of respiring carbon-based dust born into a time and place not of your choosing when you're here for a microscopic amount of time, after which you are not. Mm-hmm. And for Heidegger, you have to realize that, like I said, I didn't choose to be born a male or Jewish, or in America, the offspring of working class people. And Heidegger, what he says is, yeah, but you still have to make choices and accept responsibility for those choices, even though you didn't choose any of the parameters that ultimately limit what's available to you. And moreover, you're going to not always make good choices. So now you're guilty for your choices. And then he uses the poet Rilke. He has a phrase, Becker uses it in The Denial of Death, the guilt of unlived life. I just love that. You have to accept that you have already diminished and in many ways amputated your own possibilities by virtue of choices that you've made or just as often have declined to make because you are reluctant to accept responsibility for the opportunities that you are now able to create by virtue of seeing the possibilities that lay before you. So anyway, Heidegger then says, look, okay, so, I'm a professor and I live in America in the 21st century. Well, if I was in the 3rd century living in a yurt in Mongolia, I'm not going to have an opportunity to be a professor. But what he submits is that there is some aspects of whatever I am that are independent of my cultural and historical circumstances. In other words, there is a me of sorts. Heidegger would take vigorous issue, and so would Heidegger scholars, because I'm not claiming to understand him. This is my classic comic book rendering. But Heidegger's point is that you get to the point where you're able to say, okay, I am a contingent historical and cultural artifact. But so what? If I was, now if I was transported 1,000 years in the past in Asia, I'd be in the same situation. I would still be conditioned by time and place. I would still have choices that I could make within the confines of what opportunities are afforded to me. And then Heidegger says, if I can get that far, this is his language. He says that there is a transformation. And he calls it a turning. You're turning away from a flight from death, and you are allowed, therefore, you see a horizon, is his word, of opportunity that makes you in a state of anticipatory resoluteness with solicitous regard for others, that makes your life seem like an adventure perfused with unshakable joy. All right, let me unpack those things. It is beautiful. I love, Lex, that you're resonating to the time thing. So he's like, okay, we already talked about now, anticipatory is already hopeful because it's looking forward. Yeah. Right, to be resolute, it means to be steadfast and to just have confidence in what you're doing moving forward. All right, solicitous, I had to look up all these words, by the way. It just means that you are concerned about your fellow human beings. But I love the idea, even if it seems allegorical, I don't mind that at all. This idea, you said love earlier, and I think that when Heidegger is talking about being solicitous, that's as close as he can get. There's an Italian.
Yes, sorry to interrupt. So what was that line again with the solicitous of the?
Okay,
the whole thing of turning away from death and this.
Yeah,
all the words you said are just beautiful.
I love those words. Yeah, anticipatory resoluteness that is accompanied with solicitous regard to our fellow humans, which makes life appear to us to be an ongoing adventure that is permeated by unshakable joy. Now, again, Heidegger's not Mary Poppins.
I just got a tattoo.
This
is great.
I just love it.
Is that exact quote?
No, I'm piecing together. These are his exact words and I spent the last 2 years reading almost everything that I can find because I want to, I'm sick of death. You said it, so I want to second what you say, Lex. So it's not about death. It's the Sherwood Anderson guy. He's a novelist that I like about. He wrote a book called Winesburg, Ohio. And now I'm going to forget what he said on his tombstone. But, it was something to the effect. He said, life, not death, is the great adventure. The point being is that, to consider that we must die and the existential implications of that. Really, the goal, the way I see it, is getting from hate to love.
Yeah.
And I feel like Heidegger has a way of thinking about things that moves us more in that direction. And so that's kind of my current preoccupation, is to take what I just said to you and to talk about it with my colleagues and other academic psychologists, because the way we started with Ernest Becker, remember I said earlier, I wasn't trained in any of these things. I'm an egghead researcher that was doing experiments about biofeedback. And, then we read these Becker books, and I thought they were so interesting that for the first few years, we didn't have any studies.
Mm-hmm.
I just would travel around and I'd be like, here's what this Becker guy says. I think this is cool.
Yeah.
Well, my present view is I'm like, here's what this Heidegger guy says. I think these ideas are consistent with what Becker is saying because they are anchored in death anxiety. But I like that direction as an alternative to the Kierkegaardian insistence that the only psychologically tenable way to extricate ourselves from maladaptive reactions to death anxiety is through faith in the traditional sense.